Alexei Navalny, Russian opposition leader and a political detainee, has died in prison on Friday, February 16, 2024. The official narrative presented by the administration of the corrective colony where Navalny was detained is the following. Navalny was granted an outdoor walk at 12:11 p.m. Shortly after the walk, he began to feel unwell and lost consciousness almost immediately. Resuscitation procedures were initiated by the ambulatory brigade of the colony. An ambulance was called and arrived 7 minutes later. Despite continued resuscitation efforts for the next 30 minutes, Navalny remained unresponsive. At 2:17 p.m., Alexei Navalny was pronounced dead. An official announcement of the correctional facility regarding his demise was published no later than 2:19 p.m. The cause of his death, a thromboembolism, was communicated through semi-official channels within the next hour. So, let's try to figure out what actually happened to Alexei. What's wrong with the official narrative regarding his demise? Spoiler, none of this adds up. And what will be the effect of his tragic death on the political landscape in Russia and in the West? To make it make sense, I will shortly remind you of the key points of Alexei Navalny's recent biography that eventually brought him into the cell of strict regime colony, located in desolate hamlet of Harp, beyond the Arctic Circle. In August 2020, Navalny visited Novosibirsk and Tomsk to support regional bureaus of his federal network of headquarters, known as Navalny HQs. On August 20, 2020, during the flight from Tomsk to Moscow, Navalny suddenly fell ill and lost consciousness. The airplane quickly returned to Tomsk, where Navalny was hospitalized. Later on August 22, Navalny was evacuated to the German health center Charité, where it was determined that he was likely exposed to the so-called choline esterase inhibitor, a substance known to be a key component of a chemical warfare agent, Novichok. The exact same substance that was used to poison former Russian intelligence officer Sergei Skripal and his daughter in 2018 in Salisbury, Great Britain. Obviously, Russia vehemently denied any allegations and came up with a bunch of complete nonsense and ridiculous conspiracy theories. It's worth mentioning that in 2020, Navalny was still on probation after being convicted on charges of embezzlement in a 100% fabricated Ifrashe case. By the way, don't buy anything from this piece of shit company. And while Alexei was in rehabilitation in Germany, Russian Federal Penitentiary Service claimed that Navalny failed to comply with mandatory checkups in the police, and therefore his probation should be revoked in favor of serving his prison sentence. To describe this pizdets as an outrageous injustice would be to put it very mildly. Yet the message from Russian governors was very clear. You should stay abroad. Don't come back, or you will get imprisoned. In September 2020, he was discharged from the hospital and settled in Freiburg. In collaboration with Krista Groziev of Bellingcat, he uncovered the identities of the FSB agents that were responsible for his attempted assassination. Navalny even managed to call one of them, posing as an official from the president's administration. During this telephone call, Navalny made him confess about everything and lured him into providing detailed information about their plot to poison him. Shortly after, Navalny published a groundbreaking investigation about Putin's lavish palace near the city of Sochi, which according to Alexei was the largest bribe in the history of modern Russia. This investigation is by far the most viewed YouTube video on political topics in the Russian language. In January 2021, Navalny made a decision to return in Russia, where immediately upon his arrival he was arrested and sent to a detention center on January 17, 2021. His case was rehearsed shortly. Despite having a valid decision of the European Court of Human Rights stating that this case is politically motivated and should be thrown away, acknowledged by the Russian Ministry of Justice, the judge, Natalia Repnikova, sentenced Navalny to 3.5 years in a correctional colony in Pokrov. This judge would die suddenly just half a year later. Alexei and his network of headquarters announced global rallies in his support. That was probably the last truly large rallies in Russia. That, however, yielded no tangible results. And this is where I think Alexei and his team seriously miscalculated. I'm sure that Alexei was ready for the detention and imprisonment, and he wasn't that naive to believe that street protest would get him out of jail. but it seems like they seriously underestimated the ability of the system to confine and oppress this type of protests, to prevent them from growing into something important. We saw that a criminal running an armored motorized brigade can overtake a million-plus city overnight and unironically threaten Moscow, and there is no one to stop him. That the system can brutally fight back students with white stripes who take off their shoes before standing on the bench. But no one within the system desires to risk their lives struggling against armed and fierce mercenaries. The system is brittle, but it's only brittle in a fight with armed bandits. In a confrontation with unarmed civil society, it is eerily effective. The aftermath of these protests was grim. Putin's regime recognized Navalny headquarters as too potent an asset for their position, and deemed it too risky to allow this organization to exist. Thus, within 2021, Navalny headquarters were proclaimed an extremist organization and shut down entirely. The legal proceedings surrounding this case were nothing short of total buffoonery. Prosecutors didn't even try to make it legal alike. In the indictment document, there were 1,000 pages of screenshots of Navalny's YouTube channel, photo of prosecutors' working desk, some unrelated references, screenshots of random websites. A complete mess. But more to that, after proclaiming Navalny headquarters an extremist organization, authorities went on to prosecute Navalny himself for founding an extremist organization. This is an absolutely insane case of retrospective law enforcement. But when Navalny was sentenced to 19 more years in prison, it became quite clear that the law, even the formal Russian law, has nothing to do with this. It was sealed in Kremlin that Navalny will not see the light of day as long as Putin is in power. And that turned his imprisonment into a de facto life sentence. This new sentence was a convenient excuse to eliminate Navalny from informational public sphere entirely. His attorney could visit him in Pokrov almost daily and communicate about the conditions of his detention, his health, etc. However, authorities now had the option to transfer Navalny to the maximum security colony for those convicted of particularly grave crimes. He was transferred to the colony, situated in the urban locality Harp, near the city of Lobytnangy. I guess you have a general feeling of where it is, just looking on this map. And this is where the real bullying of Navalny just began. Maximum security colonies have specific blocks for severe violators of internal rules, known as the cell-type premises. Concrete boxes, devoid of heating and ventilation, often referred to as prison within prison. The conditions in these blocks are so harsh that prisoners are not allowed to be held there for more than 15 days consecutively. Given that the colony is in far north, I think it's safe to say that the temperature in these concrete boxes was barely above 50-55 degrees Fahrenheit, with humidity close to 100%. Alexei Navalny was sent to those premises 27 times. He spent there 300 days. Among his heinous violations of the internal rules were said profanity in the toilet, didn't greet a guard properly, didn't present himself properly when asked, had the top button of his shirt unfastened, had the shoelace untied. Well, I don't want to continue this. You got the idea. This is a torture. C'est n'importe quoi ça. Aside from this, his communication with the outside world was also crippled, especially after his attorneys also faced criminal prosecution. Yet another signal from the Kremlin. Not only Navalny would remain silent and suffer, but anyone who has the audacity to collaborate with him, to communicate his words to the public, even as his attorney, would join him and suffer. Navalny was just 47 years old. However, such unbearable conditions, coupled with an absolute isolation and slow descent into the obscurity, can certainly break even younger and healthier men. These are the last shots of Alexei, done during a court session on Thursday, February 15, 2024. He jokes that the judge and the prosecutor must tip him, since he has a lot of fines to pay. Frankly, he doesn't look terminally ill or utterly exhausted. Quite the contrary. He seems full of energy and relatively healthy, at least for the person who spends most of his time in a cold concrete box. And while it's not implausible for a 47-year-old to die suddenly given the conditions of the imprisonment, it's just very suspicious, considering the attempted murder of Navalny, orchestrated by special services in the past. Even the timeline presented by the officials doesn't add up. They specify when the walk began, but do not disclose when it ended. They claim that initial resuscitation was started by the ambulatory brigade of the colony. That's not true. This colony doesn't have a resuscitation brigade. As revealed by the Telegram channel, close to the sources in the Kremlin, the only felcher they have is a previously homeless hygienist who isn't capable of any resuscitation procedures and doesn't possess the needed equipment. For the ambulance brigade to arrive at the colony in Harp from the closest emergency hospital in Labytnangi in just 7 minutes means that they were traveling at speeds of 180–190 miles per hour. Thromboembolism, reported as the cause of death, could only have been established after the autopsy. And finally, Navalny was pronounced dead at 2:17 p.m. by the ambulance brigade in the colony. It took just 2 minutes to announce it publicly on the Penitentiary Service webpage. Not only is it not feasible, it's not even plausible, not even theoretically. Announcing the demise of Alexei Navalny is not the decision that prison's administration might take on its own. They mandatorily had to get approval from high authorities. And that brings us to the president's administration, where such decisions are eventually made. Conceal or not conceal, inform or not inform, where, when, how, every detail should have been agreed. And that would have taken at least a couple of hours. This renders the entire official timeline a complete nonsense. More to this, in her commentary for Bellingcat, banker Anna Itkina reveals that on Friday, February 16, the first deputy of the Federal Security Service, General Sergei Korolov, had an important meeting scheduled for 8 a.m., which he cancelled shortly before it began. She speculates that by 8 a.m., the Federal Security Service was already aware of Navalny's demise. Of course, this is just speculations, but it makes much more sense compared to officially published communique. From the moment this news emerged, I realized that they will be able to gauge the degree of shadiness by how quickly the body of Alexei Navalny would be delivered to his relatives. And there are already a lot of strange things around this. Navalny's mother received a telegram informing that Alexei had passed away the same day, Friday, February 16. She was told that her son's body is in the morgue in the city of Salihard. But when she arrived there the next day with Navalny's attorney, the morgue appeared to be closed for some reason, while it's a 24/7 facility. When they telephoned the manager, he revealed that Navalny was not there and hadn't been delivered at all. Meanwhile, the administration of the colony where Navalny died claimed that his body was taken by investigation committee agents for inspections. Not only it gets increasingly more shady by minutes, to my knowledge, it's straight up illegal. So for the moment we have the following facts. The official timeline is almost certainly falsified. Navalny's body is not delivered to his relatives. Draw your own conclusion. Frankly speaking, it makes almost no difference whether Navalny was poisoned again, and this is a straightforward assassination, or he died of natural causes due to health deterioration in utterly disabling conditions of imprisonment. Navalny was a political detainee, and the Kremlin is fully responsible for his death. Some might speculate that this assassination is rather harmful for the Kremlin and therefore makes no sense. It's clear that Navalny would stay in prison as long as this regime stays operative. And if for some reason regime collapsed, Navalny would be the least of their concerns. The assumption that Alexei was a threat because he might potentially be used in the future by one of the Kremlin elite groups aiming to overthrow Putin and legitimize themselves through Navalny looks far-fetched, if not as an outright fantasy. So from a reasonable, logical point of view, Navalny was already rendered innocuous. Killing him only draws undesirable attention and symbolizes him as a martyr. But that's the morbid beauty of Russian governors. They are devoid of any reason and logic. In 2003, Putin destroyed one of the largest oil companies in Russia, Yukos, and got its CEO Mikhail Khodorkovsky in prison. That was an awful decision that drastically affected the investment climate and basically crippled European integration of Russia. The decision that made no sense. Journalist Anna Politkovskaya was shot at the entrance of her residence in 2006. She openly and extensively criticized Putin for his policy regarding Chechnya. Such a blatant political assassination cast a huge shadow on the Kremlin. Yet it was absolutely clear that this couldn't have happened without the Kremlin's agreement. Another insane, harmful decision. Politician and fierce opponent of Putin's regime, Boris Nemtsov, was shot in the back several hundred meters from the Kremlin wall in 2015. By chance, cameras in the most secure place in Russia didn't work that day, and police had a hard time to question a suspect because he, I quote, didn't open the door. Politician Vladimir Kara-Murza was poisoned twice in 2015 and 2017, allegedly by the same group that later poisoned Navalny. After 2 failed murder attempts, Putin imprisoned Kara-Murza. He's now in jail, sentenced to 25 years, and I'm seriously worried for his life. All these acts of political violence had absolutely no sense other than indulging Putin's ego. From logical perspective, it was harmful for Putin in the first place, and should have never happened. But where logic fails, psychological explanation fits perfectly. We must embrace the idea that Putin is not a mastermind villain. He is not a strategic genius who is playing 4D chess and always has a plan. He's a vengeful, dusty clerk, a character of classic Russian literature, full of fears and complexes. And if you look at political violence from this perspective, it all suddenly makes perfect sense. The initial reaction of Russian political elites and their propaganda servants was 146% predictable. Navalny was killed by Western special services to set up and defame Putin, who is gloriously winning in Ukraine and close to make a pact with Trump to bring into disgrace a national leader who is going to triumphantly win the most democratic elections imaginable. Do you know when I heard exactly the same narrative? When Navalny was poisoned. When Kara-Murza was poisoned. Twice. When Boris Nemtsov was shot in the back. When Politkovskaya was assassinated. Every time it's the same. The bloody West just can't stop killing personal enemies of Vladimir Putin. It is laughable, but laughable for us. A lot of people will go with this narrative. More Russia transforms into a purely schizophrenic state, the more viable such explanations are. So, what will be the internal reaction? Will Russia finally erupt with fierce protests? No. Younger and politically active citizens are either in immigration or threatened into non-existence by Stalin-era-like sentences for even minor disobedience. At the same time, I can't figure out how the West could possibly react. In 2021, Joe Biden warned of devastating consequences for Russia if Navalny died. But what exactly can they do now? Russia is already the most sanctioned country in history. Putin is wanted as a criminal. There is a warrant for his arrest issued by ICC. What else you can possibly come up with? There will be rhetoric. Putin and his regime will be strongly condemned. Again, some obscure random functionaries will be personally sanctioned. And that's it. Both Russian international relations and domestic politics are in such a shambles that even assassination of Navalny doesn't change anything. It's already cold, gloomy cemetery. And it's the most devastating conclusion that segued from this tragedy. It seems like Alexei died for nothing. But it's not totally true. When Navalny returned to Russia, he knew that he would be arrested and imprisoned, that he risked staying in prison until Putin's regime collapsed, and he definitely knew that he might be killed. Yet he made a decision to return. Because he's a Russian politician, he fought for the implementation of his ideas, his beliefs, his vision of a perfect future in Russia. He fought for justice and dignity, and he was ready to sacrifice himself, defending those values. To be ready for such an ultimate sacrifice is a trait you rarely meet nowadays, especially in urbanized Western societies. What about you? Are you ready for such an ultimate sacrifice? Do you have something to die for? Because for myself, I'm not sure I have. Brave men do things and die in prison. Cowards speak on YouTube. I'm the Northern Philosopher. Take care.